She'd stared at the scene in front of her with a pretty blank but slightly curious expression, as she tilted her head with one ear lifted, looking back and forth between James and his enormous foe. Even the human himself, despite the fact that he had just been thrown through the ship like a shot-put shot, had a mostly annoyed and incredulous look on his face as he crouched closely to the ground. His eyes narrowed at the Lizardor in a "now what's this about" kind of way. There were probably few people in the galaxy that would have reacted with mere annoyance when being apparently attacked by the largest living sapient predator, but James's face clearly spoke of him having way larger problems at the moment than his friend's lust for battle. There was a brief standoff between the two disproportionate opponents, during which all four eyes of the Tenastrocyte were locked onto James in intense focus, as the giant lizard cracked his knuckles and rolled his shoulders, as if he was loosening up for what was ahead. However, he did not make an active move yet. After a couple of long moments, James apparently decided that it was enough, and he pushed himself back to his feet. His eyes never left Conglorch's as he did, and once he stood straight again, he took a page out of Sheeda's book here, and tilted his head to the side in a questioning way, obviously feeling like he shouldn't even directly have to ask here, before the enormous reptile would explain himself. Their eyes were locked with each other for a while longer, before Conglorch started to slowly walk towards James. Slowly, step by step. James's only reaction to it was that his head slowly leaned back more and more, as he had to look up further and further to keep his eyes locked with those of the Tenastrocyte. Otherwise, neither his expression nor his posture changed, as the giant approached him. Though, admittedly, just the head tilting alone eventually turned slightly comical, as he had to crank it further and further back. Still, even if it looked slightly ridiculous, James seemingly refused to budge. She'd watched all this unfold with mild curiosity. Although the scene was strange, she was admittedly amused by the demeanour of the two men. The way that both of them didn't seem concerned about the sensibility of their actions for even a second was amazingly ludicrous if she thought about it for more than a second. Yet it somehow still seemed perfectly normal around here. Eventually, as they basically stood right in front of each other, Conglorch also had to tilt his head so his own jaw wouldn't block his field of vision and prevent him from seeing the human. And like that, the two unevenly matched men stood, both with their heads at odd angles so they could keep up their eye contact as if it was mandatory. Conglorch released a deep bellow that was loud enough to make the room shake slightly. Sheena could feel the ground under her feet vibrate as the sound filled her ears. She could also feel it vibrating in her chest, and for a moment, her brain was almost tricked into thinking that she was purring for some weird reason, before her reasonable mind overrode that idea. For just a moment longer, the eye contact was held up, in a way that would have most likely seemed tense under any usual circumstances. But in this case, it was mostly just stupid. Even for Sheeda, there wasn't a doubt in her mind that nothing serious, at least not physically serious, was going to happen here. And that much was confirmed a moment later, when Conglorch's enormous jaws opened ever so slightly, as his raspy throat released an amused scoff that got cut apart by his sharp teeth. Then he undid the tilt of his head, meaning that he was now unable to see James due to how close the two men were standing to each other. Then he slowly shifted his weight to the side, turned, and walked away, leaving James as the lonely participant of this now one-sided staring contest. For a moment, it didn't seem to occur to the human's brain that the tension had been broken. However, after his mind had a few seconds to boot up again, his eyes suddenly lost their intense focus and glazed over for a moment, before his concentrated expression changed into a completely confused one, as he fully realized that the Tenastrocyte was seriously just walking away from him. Staring in bafflement for a couple of seconds, as the situation seemed to seriously not compute for him, James's dark eyes seemed to try their absolute darndest to make sense of what had just happened, but apparently to no avail. Meanwhile, the enormous lizard just kept sauntering away, a slightly amused look on his stiff face, although to Shida it spoke way more of satisfaction, like he had gotten exactly what he wanted. Finally, James just threw his arms up slightly, his palms pointed to the ceiling, as he loudly asked, "What the hell, man?" Conglorch ignored him. Purposefully so, Shida was sure. After his question was so bluntly brushed off, James's gaze shifted slightly to look at Shida, his expression clearly reading as, "You seen this?" However, Shida could do little more than shrug, and admittedly chuckle a bit, because she knew as much as he did here. At face value, the big guy had apparently just suddenly gotten the urge to play Toss-a-Primate for a second, before going back to sleep. But if they were being honest, both of the Deathworlders knew that there had to be more to it. And if they were being a bit more honest, they also knew that he would probably reveal it to them only a bit later. Following him and pestering him about it now may have been the immediate impulse, but the probability of actually getting any answer out of him that way was, all things that they knew about the guy considered, most likely rather low. Therefore, all they could do was stare at each other for a moment longer, each as baffled as the other, as the ludicrous situation slowly faded out once the giant had disappeared back into his quarters. Luckily for them, their current state was interrupted before it could get awkward, because the still open door that James had been so unceremoniously tossed through earlier now allowed the sounds of quick footsteps to echo through it, only moments before revealing the sight of Coco, who stopped at the side of its frame and leaned through the opening as if to only glance into the room and move on immediately, should she not find what she was looking for here. However, once her green eyes fell onto James, they lit up with a twinkle, and the rest of her body quickly followed her head through the door with small steps that were quickly turned into a tiptoeing charge at James. The commander seemingly took great care to take as absolutely minuscule steps as she possibly could, until she was about an arm's length away from James. Then she simply tipped forwards. There was absolutely no mistaking it for tripping or otherwise missing a step accidentally. No, she simply allowed herself to fall, stiff as a board, and fully confident that James would catch her. And obviously he did, holding his hands out slightly to grip her under her arms, which he had stretched out a bit to make it easier on him. Shida tilted her head at the display, wondering just what her superior was up to there, while Coco glanced up at James with big, sparkly eyes, once he had caught her. "Jamie!" Coco whined in his arms, not even making any effort to stand up by herself again, as James held her, and it was clear that she was deliberately making her voice as pathetic as possible as she made her plea. Since they were officially off-duty here, the commander was wearing a white t-shirt and tight pants instead of her uniform, and it was also one of the few times that she wore her hair openly, instead of braided into a tight ponytail. Her wavy hair hung down loosely on both sides of her face, as the officially deadliest person on board continued her theatrics. "I'm hungry. Let's go to the kitchen and whip something up, alright? The hotel food during the last weeks made me miss some good home cooking." Shida snorted slightly, while James looked down with slight disappointment. "Seriously, Coco?" he asked her, and in a single motion lifted her up and placed her right back on her feet, which really wasn't much of a task in this gravity. Once she stood on her own again, James crossed his arms. It was clear he was still a bit irritated from what had happened earlier. First of all, you can just ask like a normal person, and second of all, I really have other things to do than cook for you. Coco was entirely undeterred by James's serious attitude, though she still did dial back the paltriness of her approach a bit, only to then ramp up her impishness by twice that. The look on her face switched from cute and admiring to sly and coquettish on a dime, as her mouth curled into a smirk. Tipping forwards again, although not nearly as extremely as before, she leaned against James's chest, which was made much easier by the size difference between the two. James didn't even flinch as she flatly pressed her hands onto his chest, and looked up at him again. She'd watched the unimpressed, almost bored and annoyed expression on her boyfriend's face, at the jokingly seductive display with some interest, tilting her head a bit and twitching one ear up as she looked out for anything that might be hidden underneath his reaction. Though it seemed like the two humans were truly just going through the motions right now, which was probably not surprising when considering the sort of relationship they used to have, and maybe technically still had, whenever James wasn't currently in an exclusive relationship.
Come on! It's been so long since we cooked together. Besides, we're out of comm range. If there's ever any moment to relax for a bit, it is right now. And aren't you still under direct orders to relax a bit?
Coco kept up her spiel for a moment. However, it seemed like she, too, quickly noticed that she wasn't going to get to James like that. With her face reading as something along the lines of drastic measures it is, she then decided to turn up the heat a bit.
If you do this for me, I could also.
Before finishing her sentence, she pulled herself up to James's shoulder in order to whisper directly into his ear. And to her credit, she actually managed to do so quietly enough that Sheeta wasn't able to pick up what the commander had suggested from where she stood. Going by James's reaction alone, however, it seemed like it had most likely been the sort of suggestion that in human societies would usually not be made so openly in front of someone's committed partner. Also, it had to really be quite something, because it actually made James's face flush ever so slightly red, with his lips pressing more tightly together for a moment as he visibly swallowed. It didn't seem like he was tempted in any way, but whatever Coco whispered there had likely brought back some memories for him, and Sheeta wasn't quite sure if those were memories that he would have rather not remembered at that moment specifically. Quickly deciding that his best option would be to just outright ignore that last part, James cleared his throat, while Coco lowered herself away from his shoulder again. Technically, those orders ended once we set foot on the ship, he began to explain, and he seemingly wanted to say some more on the topic. However, at that moment, Sheeta decided to finally interject. "Actually, I'm pretty hungry too, James," she said, keeping a close look on her boyfriend's face as she said it. His gaze quickly shot over to her, and it was immediately suspicious. He seemed utterly convinced that she was planning something. Well, he was a smart guy, after all. Sheeta smiled at him slightly as she finished her proposition. "Maybe we could all eat together. I think you could really take a break, especially after whatever that throw earlier was supposed to be." James's dark eyes narrowed even further. Next to him, the sparkling Coco's flared right back up as she realized she had an accomplice here. Sheeta held candid eye contact with James. For a moment, she was worried that this would mutate into another scene, like the one between him and Conglorch earlier. However, it took barely more than 10 seconds before James sighed and relented, closing his eyes and hanging his head slightly. "I'll make enough for everyone human-sized," he said, while clearly suppressing a sigh, though Sheeta could tell most of his disappointment was an act. It wasn't like James didn't generally enjoy cooking. His gaze came up again to look at her as he ordered, "Tell everyone there's going to be a curry later, alright? And of course some plain meat for you." Sheeta quickly walked up to him and rubbed her forehead against his chin, letting out a brief chuff that quickly turned into a mild purr. "Thank you," she muttered gently and genuinely, as he closed his eyes and enjoyed the contact before she pulled away again. Once she did, Coco decided to take things up a notch, going for the more human approach to wrap her arms around his neck, to hoist herself high enough to press a loud and wet kiss onto James's cheek.
"You're the best, Jamie,"
she proclaimed loudly, as she bounced away from him again, while he wiped her leftover saliva off his cheek with a roll of his eyes.
"You'll see. I've gotten much better in the kitchen. I haven't burned rice in months."
Releasing a long breath in a, "well, this is sure going to be something" kind of way, James then waved Sheeta with the back of his hand, as he slowly made his way towards the ship's kitchen, still closely occupied by Coco as he walked. Sheeta snorted and smiled to herself once she was sure that James wasn't going to turn and look anymore. She was aware that, in a human context, this was probably somewhere around the thing that she would be supposed to get jealous over, but for her it was mostly amusing. And she knew that James wasn't going to expect her to be more human in that regard. If he actually wanted Coco to back off, he would have told her. They knew each other well enough for that. And so the feline didn't feel too bad to have a bit of fun at her boyfriend's expense here. Then again, maybe this wouldn't be too much of a punishment for him in the end. Shaking off the thought for the time being, she quickly started walking to fulfill her task of telling everyone that lunch would be served soon. Just standing outside of Andres' cabin, she already knew that she would have to cover her ears once inside, and that knocking would be a wasted effort. The thumping sounds coming out of the Major's room sounded soft when standing out here. However, from experience, she knew that they were caused by music he was listening to while wearing headphones, which meant the fact that she could hear it at all while standing on the other side of a rather thick metal door was concerning, to say the least. Quickly, she pulled her phone out to shoot him a quick message that she would be coming in. They may have been out of comm range, however they could still communicate over the ship's local systems. Andres quickly wrote a reply asking what she needed, and it was around that moment that she'd realized she could also just give him the full message via text, instead of needing to enter his room at all. So she did just that. Andres replied with a cartoony image of an index finger and a thumb forming a circle, while the other fingers were spread apart. A human okay. Gladly taking the option of not stepping into the noisy room, to possibly get a full blast of the music once Andres' ears were no longer blocking his path, once he took the headphones off, she'd have turned away from the door and began to walk down the hall instead. For a moment, she wondered if she should simply text everyone the good news, instead of walking around, but she kind of felt like talking. Well, not in Andres' noisy room, but in general. So she decided to go around a bit. The closest room to Andres' was Admir's, and she'd have firmly knocked against his door, awaiting answer. James's ex-flame was usually pretty good for conversation, and pretty eager for it too, so she liked her chances of getting a bit of chat on here. However, as she waited a couple of seconds with no answer, she got slightly unsure about that first assessment, and as the door was unceremoniously opened for her by a bed-headed Admir, who was only wearing saggy pants and gazed at her through glazed-over, more than tired eyes, she made the judgment call that trying to rope him into a conversation right now would not be something that she was going to do. Out of everyone on board, she knew better than most what it meant to be tired, especially since she had started to hang around humans a lot. "James is making curry. Want us to wake you when it's done, or nah?" She'd quickly informed Admir, replying to his highly sophisticated initial question of, "What?" The lieutenant let out a long yawn, quickly covering his mouth as he blinked a couple of times. "I'll," he tried to say, but was interrupted by another yawn, forcing him to finish his sentence with a high and drawn-out voice. "Warm it up later." She'd nodded, gave the man a smile and a pat on the shoulder. "All right," she said reassuringly. "Sleep well. I'll make sure you're not disturbed again." "Think," Admir said, and yawned again, shaking his head as he closed the door, leaving Sheeda with 2 down, free to go. However, Sam's room was empty, and so was the one Nia and Tuya shared. So now the question was, where had those 3 gone? Well, easy enough for Sam, Sheeda thought to herself, as she immediately allowed her hand to fall sideways, so it pointed in the direction of the gym, then following her own pointing finger in that direction. Traversing the ship was nothing special. It was one of so many she had seen on the inside by now, and ever since she had gotten used to human architecture and engineering, it really turned to just another ship in her mind. The same plain halls, the same metal walls and doors. Luckily, knowing the captain so well had paid off doubly this time, because as she entered the gym to the sound of swiftly running footsteps on a treadmill, she quickly noticed that all of the people she was searching for had in fact come together here. A lucky break. Sam was currently running on the treadmill with an intense focus on her face, as she seemed to push herself to her absolute limit when it came to how far she could go. Meanwhile, Tuya was leaning on her back on a nearby bench, pressing weights with sweat gleaming on her forehead, although she looked nowhere near as hell-bent on testing herself as Sam did. It looked more like a light to medium workout for her. Still, not too far from her sat Nia, her white shirt stained with large splotches of sweat, and she fanned herself by pulling it away from her chest and then allowing it to fall back into place a couple of times. She was breathing quite heavily. When training along with humans, it was yet another thing that Sheeta could relate to. Although, ironically, just as she entered, Nia commented, "You two aren't human," towards her two fellow ladies, indicating that even the persistence predators could lose the battle against their own stamina when stacked against a more fit version of themselves. Sam didn't react, the focus on her face not shifting. Tuya, on the other hand, quickly pushed the weight up one last time before depositing it on the hooks above, chuckling as she scooted out from under the bar to sit up. Of course, the many plates on either side of the bar made the lift look a lot more impressive than it actually was in this gravity, though obviously Tuya was still no slouch, all things considered. The lieutenant sat down next to her girlfriend and gently nudged her own shoulder against Nia's. "We gotta get you in shape, girl," she said teasingly, which worked a lot better than Sheeta had expected, since Nia immediately snapped back. "I am in shape," with a slightly insulted but also somewhat worried expression on her face. Realizing her outburst had been exactly what Tuya wanted, Nia then quickly pulled back her reaction, and her worry soon turned to annoyance, possibly directed at herself, as she stopped her fanning and crossed her arms, looking away from Tuya for a moment. "Just not in ship shape, I guess," she then mumbled under her breath, filling her voice with a bit of mockery at the words ship shape. Tuya wasn't discouraged by that, however, as she quickly hugged Nia from behind and gave her a kiss on the neck, which in turn caused Nia to quickly crank her head all the way back, hiding her neck away from her girlfriend. "Don't," she complained. "I'm all gross and sweaty." "And I don't care," Tuya said, placing emphasis on the I, as she gently grabbed both sides of Nia's head with her hands and planted another kiss right on her forehead in an awkward pseudo-upside-down angle. Nia clearly wanted to protest once more. However, this was, yet again, the moment Sheeta decided to interject. Loudly, she cleared her throat, pulling everyone's attention onto her, even Sam's. The blonde captain took a few more swift, near-jumping steps, before literally jumping up and placing her feet on the sides of the treadmill so the belt could keep racing along underneath her without a problem, while she stood and listened. Tuya and Nia both glanced up at her from their position on the ground, not shy at all about their earlier display. In fact, as if to make a point out of it, Tuya even closed her arms a bit tighter around Nia for a second. "What's up?" She was then the first to ask the feline, while she placed her chin on Nia's shoulder. Sheeta snorted slightly as she crossed her arms, her tail playfully swaying as she looked at each of the women for a moment. "James sent me to tell you he's making lunch, so there'll be curry in a couple of minutes," she informed the room casually. "Ha! If Baz is cooking, that might actually be worth it," Sam commented, as she put both feet on the same side of the treadmill and turned her body so she could lean her back against the other side, her body hovering precariously over the still speeding belt. Nia simply pressed her hands together with a gleefully anticipating expression, which caused Tuya to look at her with slight surprise. "Your bro that good of a cook?" she asked, seeming moderately surprised at the info she gleaned from the reactions of those who knew James way better than she did. Nia giggled. "Well, when he wants to be," she replied, and now simply embraced her girlfriend's arms around her, leaning back against Tuya casually. "So I've heard," Sheeta confirmed as far as she could, since her own perspective on how good James's cooking was or wasn't was sadly rather limited when compared to her omnivorous companions. but Coco put him up to it, so I think he might want to today. Oh, sure. If he's cooking to impress Coco then, Nia said, though she left the sentence unfinished and simply rolled her eyes instead. Using that moment of silence, Sam nodded her head upwards to Sheeta to catch her attention. Good thing you're here, actually, she said, and looked Sheeta up and down for a moment. You up for a bit of exercise before the food's served? Sheeta looked at her with an eyebrow raised, and one ear turning in her direction. Not that I'm against it on principle, but what exactly would you get out of that? She asked, being a bit hung up on Sam's particular phrasing of good that you're here. That almost sounded like the captain had some sort of plan for her. Sam now reached over to at least momentarily turn the constantly running treadmill off. The belt slowly powered down and slowed to a halt, which allowed Sam to push herself away from the attached armrests in order to casually walk off the machine. As the blonde woman sauntered to the side, she gave Sheeta a direct look. I just want to see how I stack up now, she said, and gestured in the direction of the treadmill, as if asking Sheeta to get on it. Sheeta looked down at herself. She wasn't really dressed for running right now, which usually may have been an unfair disadvantage. However, in this case... You don't, she replied very directly, and gave Sam a look that was somewhere between appeasing and empathetic. Sorry to say it like that. I really mean no offense, but Sam, you know... Yes, I know, Sam said, lifting her arms slightly and closing her eyes for a moment, as her tone made it very clear that she was completely aware of the odds she was putting herself against here. I'm not going to hurt myself again. I just want to see it, all right? She'd pondered that for a moment, under the watchful gaze of Nia and Tuya, who were both observing the exchange by now. Finally, she slowly walked over to the machine, stepping on top of it and stretching for a moment. She glanced over at Sam with a slight smirk. If I didn't know better, I think that you just have a thing for watching me run, she said, and gave Sam a wink. Sam didn't look too amused, as she held eye contact with a firm expression. But you do know better, she stated matter-of-factly, before taking a step back from the treadmill to keep a certain safety distance, considering how fast the thing would be running with a Miat on top of it. Though at least she finished the movement with a gentle smile, showing that she wasn't actually miffed at Sheeta's comment or anything. Nia giggled a bit as Sheeta slowly started up the treadmill, though she ramped the speed up quite quickly, considering it would take a bit until the human invention would be pushing her limits when it came to speed. This is almost turning into an impromptu girl night, she commented amusedly, while she watched the feline slowly begin to run. And admittedly, although she was still dubious about the reasoning behind it, Sheeta had to confess that it felt pretty good. She remembered the first time she had been on a human treadmill, back when she had been picked up by the Salem, and cleared up the first suspicions. Back then, she had been a pretty hot mess emotionally as well. And then, all the humans around her had urged her to push it, and pushed as she had. She remembered the feeling. She was exhausted as hell, especially considering the change in gravity she endured back then. But it had also felt good. And without really thinking about it, and despite the fact she wasn't really dressed for the occasion, she began to run faster. As they all lined up in front of the ship's exit ramp, the feeling of descent and touchdown still present in their bones, the entire room felt perfectly quiet, as they all listened to the loud but anything but overwhelming sound of a newscast broadcast out of some phone speakers, doing their very best to reach the ears of everyone around. To mostly travelling in anonymous ships for a long time, it indeed seems like Candidate Olwen's ship has touched down on Gereliton. Due to his controversial nature, the planet's security and police forces are of course on high alert. Around me right now, you can see those who sympathise with the human ambassador, while those who came here to protest his arrival and stay on the core world have been relegated to a nearby square to get their voices out. A gesture of good faith from the local government. And over there, currently approaching the runway, is the dedicated welcoming party for the human delegation, including such figures as the local Colvery Governor HFY, the Orion-descended ambassador of the Parasine people, Tharithel, as well as the by now long-standing guest of the planet, candidate Quiz of the Andalea, who has been campaigning here for months by now, ever since...
I have no idea how you managed to arrange this, James commented, as he leaned over to Admir to look down at the phone. Seen on the camera feed show the announced people slowly approach the outside of the very ramp they were standing in front of. The fact that the governor of a core world so much as acknowledged him was just short of a miracle in his mind. Especially the Call of Re, although maybe he was a bit biased there. Easy, Admir replied with a smirk, before pushing James back into position so he wouldn't miss his cue when the ramp lowered. I did nothing, and just let the people back home handle it. The lieutenant laughed for a moment as he quickly pulled the sleeve over his left arm up a bit to expose his forearm, and, more importantly, the tattoo visible on it. Around him, everyone else quickly did the same. Seriously, Admir then continued, and nudged James's side with the back of his hand. I appreciate the trust and all, James. However, I am good, but I am not that good. James chuckled slightly before swallowing. Even if those out there were apparently the few people around here that actually liked him, stepping out in front of a large crowd never really got any easier, especially if he had to trust in the abilities of local forces to ensure his safety during it, at least for a large part. Still, it was a bit late to try and dip out now. Time to nut up or shut up. With a slight shake of the ground beneath and the walls around them, the ramp was then set into motion, slowly lowering. Once it was open just a crack, they could already hear the noise from outside. There was the typical noise pollution that came from a crowd of any sort of people, of course. However, since this was a crowd of Corlivery specifically, the general murmuring and muttering between the people as they waited to catch a glimpse of the guests of questionable honour sounded quite different from what they were all used to. Because instead of just voices speaking over each other, it sounded like a whole concert of out-of-tune violins, violas, and basses that were being plucked by an army of people. It sounded quite surreal. As the ramp opened a bit further, the first bit of bright sky peeked through the cracks between it and its frame. Its cyan colour offered quite the contrast to Earth's sky blue, and an even more drastic one to Dunamir's darker skies. The star stood at its zenith, shining down as a white ball that seemed disproportionately large for a human sense of what the sun in the sky should look like. Hot, thin air flooded into the ship, and it seemed like Gerolitum may have even been a bit warmer than the core world that James was used to. Or maybe they had just come during an inopportune time of year. Either way, James was already dreading the heat as the ramp lowered further. To his surprise, apart from their scale, the buildings he saw in the distance looked surprisingly human in their design. Usually that wouldn't have surprised him, given that Colvery's vague body shape wasn't ultimately that different from that of a human, but after seeing just how different Miat, who were even more similar to humans, preferred their buildings, he had sort of expected something more exotic. Finally, the ramp had lowered enough so they could see the people. Ivory armor and almost glowing blue eyes stared back at them in the hundreds. The deep, bark-like texture of their exoskeletons made each one of the Corvery at the same time look entirely unique, but also completely interchangeable with each other. Like one tree next to another, they were obviously very different, but somehow at the same time hard to tell apart when not in direct comparison. James did his best to fight down some of the darker biases he had against the species, caused by a single individual, and with a deep breath he began to walk down the ramp, his fist raised to the sky, and his scars exposed to the world. Like always, his friends and companions did it like he did, all of them emerging as one group with their left fists held up high. Around them, the concerto of strummed and plugged strings increased tenfold at the sight of their emergence, though luckily they didn't have to walk far like that,
because their welcoming party was already waiting for them very close by the ramp. The first one that James saw was the local governor. Ivory-coloured with blue eyes like the others, he did stand a little bit taller than most of the others of his species around them. Just as tall, though much longer in total, stood the Parasine next to him. To James, the large, semi-aquatic sauropsida admittedly offered a much friendlier sight than the ivory tower she accompanied. But that was nothing against the feeling that came over him when his ears, all over the strumming and mumbling, picked up a sound that was so deeply rooted within his ear canals that his body reacted to it in an instinctual manner. His skin shuddered into goosebumps as a cold shiver went down his back at the sound of what could only be described as teeth loudly grinding against each other. However, despite the overall unpleasantness of the sound, it still brought a smile onto James's face as his eyes followed it to its source, looking down. Quiss had not changed a bit. Admittedly, he didn't exactly know how he would have expected them to change, but still, they looked exactly how he remembered them. 3 dead fish eyes, a head and clubbed tail that were way too large for the short body, hands that looked like their fingers could cut you as you shook them, and an armour of scales that looked uncannily like human incisors. A grotesque picture that deep down made James's toenails want to curl up, but an unbelievably welcome sight nonetheless. However, although he was very glad to see them, James was not Quiss's first priority, as they slowly trotted up to the arriving group. Cranking their head as far back as it would go, Quiss glanced up at the tallest of the group, raising their hands to sign in slightly jagged but well-practiced motions.
"Hello, old friend,"
they greeted Moore, and in the corner of his vision, James could see the old Raphaelite's eyes start to water. "Hello, Quiss," she replied, with a deep, hesitant voice that was clearly restraining itself from breaking out into emotions. Deciding to let the 2 old-timers have their reunion in peace, James turned to the other 2 people awaiting him. Governor Scifi reached one of his many long, flexible arms down to James. It was one of the left ones. For a moment, James considered being spiteful and shaking it with his right hand nonetheless, but he ultimately decided against pettiness, simply grabbing the offered appendage with his organic hand. "Governor," he greeted, with a respectful hand. "Candidate?" Scifi replied, and the low tones of his strumming voice made it quite clear that he wasn't really all too eager to have a long conversation with his infamous guest. Meanwhile, Tharinvel also came a step closer, though much like Quiss, her attention did not seem to be on James for the most part, as the yellow eyes behind her natural mask were instead directed at her fellow centaur that accompanied the human.
"You must be the Venhasari that has been accompanying the ambassador," she said, and the interest in her eyes was almost palpable as she looked the Tenastrocyte up and down, to the point that even the large feelers on the back of her head swung forward slightly to pick up a hint of his chemical signals. "I have heard a lot about you." Konglorch gave a bragging chuckle and tilted his head as one of his eyes began to look over the other Sauropsida's grey plumage. Meanwhile, Sheeta made a face next to James. "Venhasari?" she wondered quietly to herself, although apparently it had been loud enough for Konglorch to hear. The massive lizard leaned his head down and tilted it lightly to the side as he opened his maw just a tad so he could whisper an explanation to the feline, though James clearly heard it as well. "That's the Parasine word for spy,"